Well, hello, this is Mr. Beat, and it's almost the end of 2024, but we are here. We made it. We're still alive. Unfortunately, Jimmy Carter is not. We just learned that a short while ago, the former president passed away at the age of 100. I did not anticipate that happening, although weirdly, I thought that it would happen this morning when I drove to the gym. That's another story, but it happened, and I think I should talk about it, but that's not what this stream's about. In fact, I've decided, I'm gonna do another stream, a separate stream tomorrow after I've gathered my thoughts more about the legacy of Jimmy Carter. I've never made a video about Jimmy Carter, but I do have a lot to say about him. I've learned a lot about him over the years. I've made a song about him. And I do think he was a great man. At the end of this stream, I'll take questions if you have specific things you want me to answer with regards to him, his legacy, his passing today. But I think generally most of you agree that he was a pretty darn good person. I can tell in the chat already, lots of RIPs. He did make it to the 2024 election. He voted in that election. But the only president in American history to reach the triple digits, he was president before I was alive. That's how old he was, because I'm old. But yeah, like I said, that's not what this stream's about. This stream is about decades in American history. The country is nearly 249 years old, a little bit older than me, and there's been almost 25 decades in American history. It's a pretty young country, actually, by world standards. I mean, China's laughing at us right now because of how young we are. We're just basically not even teenagers yet. We're tweens in the grand scope of world history. But regardless, I think we have a pretty crazy history. And I think a lot of people are still drawn to American history who don't live in the United States, not just because they like American ideals or our Constitution or other values that are uniquely associated to the United States, but just because, we've had it's still kind of an experiment. I think the 2020s are a crazy decade. We're living through a crazy time right now. I've said this before, and that's got me thinking, what about other crazy decades in American history? People always bring up, of course, the 1860s. That's when the Civil War happened. But you also got the 1960s. You got the 1940s when World War II was going down. We're going to look at a tier list, and I'm going to rank the craziest decades in American history. It's always more fun to look at years by decades anyway. There's some decades that we're not even going to go over, that it's pretty clear that they weren't that exciting, not a lot going on. But before we get into this, I do want to say I'm looking at decades in terms of craziness level based on four factors, okay? We've got the political factors, so the political craziness going on. You've got the economic factors, economic craziness going on. You've got the social/cultural factors, so stuff like the arts and how hierarchies are changing. And then finally, the conflict, how much war is going on, not just domestically, but internationally, that the United States is involved with. So, which increasingly the last 100 years, a lot of that. So have you lived through one of the craziest decades in American history? Probably. Yeah, you're going to find that out here. Find that out pretty soon. Really, this is just a way for me to further trick you into learning American history in a more digestible and fun way. So let me show you the tier list, which I've linked in the description of this video. If you want to make your own tier list, please, by all means, do so. Somebody made their own tier list in the chat earlier, but it was according to music. This isn't just music. This is everything. All right, good old tier maker. I've done several of these tier makers charts over the past 5 years on my channel. It's always a good time. As you can see, as I said earlier, for each decade, I'm looking at political craziness, cultural craziness, social craziness is included in that. Economic craziness and conflict craziness. That's where we look at the military stuff, violence. All right. And to be clear, we're looking at the period between 1776 and 2019. Okay. We're not looking at the 2020s yet because the 2020s are halfway over. We still have another, a lot has happened in the 2020s. I know it already seems like it can make this tier list, but that will be disqualified from this. I've put a few contestants down there. If you're brand new to tier lists, just know that S tier at the top means like we're talking not only the top of whatever category it is, we're talking at the top of it for a long time. Legendary status, greatest, most epic of all time status. And then from there, it just kind of follows the standard grading system that we have in most American schools here. A, B, C, D, and F. I don't even know if any of these decades are really going to make F, because the ones that made F, I just left them off this, because why even bother with those? So, all right. So we're going to start off with, 1810s are missing. I got some super chats already. Let's go through those real quick before we get started. And then the rest of them I'll do at the end, okay? Oh, great username. That decade, they attacked a bunch of sovereign native nations and killed a bunch of Native Americans, undermined their sovereignty. Oh, yeah. See, so I'm glad you brought this up. This was actually before I started streaming. You're not going to get much of this because most of the death and destruction, the genocide of the Native American peoples, that happened in the 1500s and 1600s. 1700s, yes, but most Native Americans had died before the United States even became a country. Very tragic story, but also I just don't want to go too far back, because then it would make this thing ridiculously long and convoluted. But yeah, very good point. Cyvlog, good to see you. Rest in peace to 39th President Jimmy Carter, a very decent person who was probably the best person on a human level to serve as president. I agree with that assessment. Gilsman Pirate. Oh, from the Pirate Party. Heck yeah. Hey, Mr. B, quick question before we jump in. We saw names like Republican, Progressive, and even Whig get recycled. What do you think? Why do you think free soil never got reused? 1850s was crazy. Rest in peace, Carter. I think free soil was never reused because of its strong association, probably, with the abolitionist movement. That's my guess, off the top of my head anyway. Apollo Creed, my brother says, that's a good band, by the way, too, I think, right? That's the name of the band? I don't know. My brother says the 80s are the only decade that lasted 12 years because of HW's extension of Reagan's presidency. Profound point, Apollo Creed. That's also the name of the character. Yes, okay. E for Every Gamers here, one of my earliest supporters and subscribers, gifted Mr. Beat memberships. Take advantage of that. And Cyvlog again, I reckon the 1980s are probably a very significant era. They definitely will be on this chart. Let's get into it. Thank you for all the super chats, by the way. So the first decade we're looking at is the 1770s. I want to put the 1770s at A tier. You may think, why not S tier? Well, let's just give some context here. The 1770s is when the United States became a country. It's when the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776 was signed and posted everywhere. Officially, the country was born. And by that point in 1776, war had already been raging on between the colonies, the Continental Army specifically, and other militia forces in the colonies against Britain, with the goal of independence because of various reasons. But yeah, before 1776, of course, things were really crazy with protests and massacres and a bunch of shenanigans by revolutionaries. A small group of people, relatively speaking, actually. But yeah, we're going 1776 afterward, just to keep it simple here, more simple. And the war, in terms of how crazy the war itself, the Revolutionary War we're talking about, it went from 1776 all the way to 1783 officially with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, one of many Treaty of Parises. I would say the war, kind of the violence, was craziest in the 1770s for sure. This is also, so that in terms of, I'm just jumping right ahead to the conflict craziness. Economic craziness, the Continental as a currency, that was making economics crazy as well, because the currency was inflated, so it became worthless. They didn't want to use the British currency, and so you saw a rise in really just kind of black markets and bartering going on because of rapid inflation, hyperinflation actually, technically, that happened during the late 1770s. People were struggling big time. Cultural craziness of the 1770s, not as much, but I would say more so, like, it became more important for the colonists to distinguish themselves from the British. And so you did see a shift in terms of, especially the non-aristocrats, the ones who were just ordinary citizens, distancing themselves from the British in every possible way. And that starts with style, with what clothes you wear, but also you couldn't afford those clothes anyway. Your hairstyle, just a disdain for those powdered wigs in particular, those tall boots that the aristocratic British wore. Anyway, a little bit of cultural craziness, not as much as the conflict craziness, though. And political craziness is obvious. You had, we call them the founding fathers. These were the men who, they were the ones who put themselves out there publicly saying, hey, Britain done messed up and we need to break away from them. And here's the government we ought to have that is more representative, that appeals more to the people. We feel strongly that we are not being represented, but we're being taxed like crazy. What are we going to do about slavery? I don't know. How about it just depends on which colony you're in? Most of the colonies, actually, almost technically all of the colonies at this time had slavery, legal slavery in the 1770s. So that's something else to remember. But yeah, 1770s is, you're right in the thick of the Revolutionary War. The reason why I don't put it S tier is because I think there were crazier decades. I do. And I think you can probably already guess which one is crazier. In fact, it's the only one that I think is going to be an S tier. But before we get there, let's look at the 1780s. 1780s are also A tier as far as I'm concerned, because this is when you had the end of the Revolutionary War. So there's no more warfare going on American soil. A brand new country is starting to govern itself. 13 separate colonies become 13 separate states. The first Constitution, lowercase c, the Articles of Confederation, is barely holding these 13 states together. But the country is already expanding. We already got more states joining, more people moving west of the Appalachian Mountains to settle all the way to the Mississippi River. More conflicts now with Native Americans. So that kind of covers the conflict craziness as these new settlers move west in the 1780s. You have the Northwest Ordinance, which is the first time you have a grid system that can try to plot out how land is divided up when you do settle out west. Of course, a lot of this land is Native American land that's being stolen. But regardless, Americans are moving out there in crazy numbers already as early as the 1780s. Most importantly, though, about the 1780s is the political craziness. We're talking about the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The founding father dudes I mentioned earlier, the ones who are still in the United States, some of them had traveled abroad by that point, but the ones who were around in 1787 all decided to get together in this really hot, stuffy room in Philadelphia, and they decided to just scrap the Articles of Confederation. They went in there actually hoping to save it But after a few days, they're like, I don't think that's possible. I don't think we're able to save the Articles of Confederation. I think we're going to have to create a brand new constitution. And that's what they did. And they argued and argued and argued. And by the end of the first week, it was looking like, oh, crap, what the heck are we going to do? Are we even going to survive as a country? There were two big issues that they were fighting over. Representation was the first. The smaller, less populated states were worried about being overshadowed by the larger, more populated states. So worrying about representation with the legislative body. And then, of course, the slavery issue. By this time, more and more Northerners were like, we need to get rid of slavery and at the very least abolish the slave trade, where in the South, they were, in fact, in the South, they were like, no. In fact, I think slavery needs to grow as an institution. And so there was that debate. The Great Compromise solved the representation crisis. The Three-Fifths Compromise resolved kind of resolved the slavery debate. And they were able to, a diverse group of men, diverse group of states were able to reach agreements to ratify a brand new constitution, the same constitution that we have today. Some people held out. The anti-federalists held out, demanding a Bill of Rights, which 2 years later, 1789, are drafted by James Madison, who was the main author of the Constitution. And the Bill of Rights are there to protect the rights of the citizens. The Constitution's there to limit what the federal government can do. A system's in place that does find that balance of federal power and state power, but also individual liberties, protecting individual liberties. And they were able to elect their first president, who it wasn't controversial. George Washington is easily elected as the first president, unopposed. Everybody loves him, no matter what their political leanings. But he is technically a Federalist. So the first political party, the Federalist Party, by the end of the 1780s, has already emerged, led by mostly Alexander Hamilton, of course. But yeah, that's the reason why I say 1780s is A tier, because you had that political craziness is just so, like, we feel it today. We feel the Bill of Rights. We're constantly bringing up the First Amendment and Second Amendment in particular, especially the Fifth through the Eighth Amendments, where you're talking about your rights. If you're accused of a crime, or if you do want to take someone to trial with the Seventh Amendment, these are just like, I mean, they're constantly brought up. They are sacred. Most of the Constitution is sacred to Americans to this very day. That's why the 1780s are A tier. Let's check the chat here. How are we doing it? Okay. If you're just joining us, we are ranking the craziest decades in American history. I'm drinking a Wonder Beet. They really should be a sponsor of me, but they're not. Because get it, Wonder Beet. This is not a sponsorship. I'm just drinking it per chance. I know, right? Yes, I know Jimmy Carter died. I will address it later. I did not anticipate that when I scheduled this live stream. Okay, we are skipping right over a few decades here. Okay, as you can see, these are the decades I've included. We're skipping over the 1790s. In my view, it would have been a barely F tier decade. 1800s, although you do have the election of 1800, which itself is pretty crazy. But we are actually, and then you could say the War of 1812 with the 1810s. I decided to leave all those off for brevity's sake and jump ahead to the 1820s. And I'll explain why now, but it's still probably only a C tier. 1820s is a C tier because you have essentially a change in politics more than anything else. The political craziness. Before the 1820s, you had the era of good feelings. You had a time where one political party dominated federal politics. That was the Democratic Republican Party. But they were splintering by the 1820s. There's one thing in particular that happened in 1820 that started this splinter. Already, though, there was uneasiness because of the economy going to crap. So the economic craziness caused by the Panic of 1819 definitely it already started to shake things up. But 1820, you have the Missouri Compromise, a law passed that was the first big crisis in terms of the expansion of West, and should slavery expand as well out West. Many Southerners, of course, said yes, Missouri should be a slave state, but Northerners were freaking out because that meant that, well, now there's going to be an imbalance. There's going to be more slave states than free states at this point. And so the Missouri Compromise made it so that part of Massachusetts, the northern area that borders the Maritimes today, would become the state of Maine as a free state. That way there was an even number of slave states and free states. But what about the future? Well, then there would be an imaginary line of latitude in which that latitude would go all the way to the western border of the United States. North of that line, all future states would be free states. South of that line, all future states would be slave states, even though I think a lot of them knew already that it's probably not going to work out long term because you got desert out there. They're not going to want slaves working in the desert as much because most of the money being made with slave labor is agricultural, like based on agriculture. Okay, I don't know, but 1820s political craziness gets accelerated during the election of 1824 when you have a four-way race and the rise of Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party, who is such a slap in the face to the establishment at the time, the so-called elites of Washington, D.C. It catches them off guard. The Democratic Party and Andrew Jackson marketed themselves as the guy for the common man. And also the 1820s is the first time where in many states, you don't have to own property to be able to vote. You can just be any white dude and be able to vote. So this is the first time where you had poor white men voting in elections. And overwhelmingly, they voted for Andrew Jackson and others who called themselves Jacksonian because they modeled their politics after Andrew Jackson. The Democratic Party rose because of the average white dudes. Of course, women couldn't vote at this time, and people of color cannot vote. Most of the people of color in the United States at the time were still slaves, and Andrew Jackson was a slave owner himself, had horrible racist views, and in particular with Native Americans. But regardless, transforms politics. By the end of the 1820s, Jacksonian democracy rules. Jackson gets a second term. He gets first elected in 1828. And you have just like a reaction, like the former Democratic Republicans are all scrambling to just unite against Jackson and his movement, and that becomes the Whig Party. Also, cultural craziness, I would say. There's another big shift, I think, with culture happening in the 1820s. In terms of like, there's more American-made art. Before then, it seemed to be like they were importing more art, music, painting, sculpture, whatever, from predominantly Europe. But after the 1820s, it seemed to be more like, okay, let's check out American-made stuff first and foremost. And so by this time, a more distinct American culture had emerged. You also had the rise of the Second Great Awakening by this point, this had really changed the culture for folks, how they practice religion, a form of Protestant Christianity that was uniquely American. And in terms of economic craziness, I already mentioned the Panic of 1819, that you had some problems with the central bank that Jackson really instigated. Conflict craziness, not a whole lot going on. So that's why this kind of drops down to C tier. Hey, Oscar. Yeah, thank you. You're not sticking around? Oh, come on, Oscar. Anyway, okay. So now the 1830s we could have on here definitely as an F tier, I think, but I should have just exempted F tier because they didn't even make the cut. So, whoops. I'm going to delete it for right now, actually. Okay, so we don't even have F tier, because if it was F tier, it wouldn't be on this chart. 1840s is going to be D tier, though, because it should be a little bit higher up, because you had a bunch of movements happening around the country. I think you had mostly it was like social movements. Most famously, so we're starting with the cultural craziness here. You had the rise of abolitionism. The anti-slavery movement really dramatically grew in the 1840s to a point where they became like a big influence on politics, especially in New England. And then also you had other movements like I already mentioned the Second Great Awakening by this time had matured as a movement. You had a movement to get kids in schools, the normal school movement, like making it a normal thing for kids to actually have to go to school. And not only that, the government would pay for it. So it'd be essentially free. I mean, paid for by taxes, but so the whole idea of public schools began to gain a lot of traction, getting more and more people able to read, because at the beginning of the 1800s, hardly any Americans knew how to read. By the end of the 1800s, that had flipped entirely. You had the vast majority of Americans could read. So a big change with that. Also by the 1840s, another big, this is an economic craziness thing. You had the Industrial Revolution had reached the United States, and lots of people were making lots of money. So that also goes with economic craziness. You had the rise of new inventions. The railroad was a new invention. The telegraph was a new invention. You had political craziness in terms of, you had James Polk, for starters, who was a protege of Andrew Jackson, but he kind of took it up to the next level and dramatically increased the size of the country. Actually, 1840s could go up to C just for the reason why, like the Mexican-American War alone. The more I think about it, maybe because of that war with the conflict craziness, although the United States easily defeated Mexico in that war, the results of it were so crazy. Yeah, let's bump up 1840s to C tier. Yeah. The more I think about it, because they, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, you gained the northern half of Mexico. Plus, Polk was able to negotiate a deal with Britain to gain the southern half of Oregon Territory. So this is the reason why our country, the United States, exists from sea to shining sea, as the poem says. The fact that the country is from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean is because of what happens during the 1840s. Not only that, in 1848, you get people moving to the West Coast, even if they have to go all the way around the southern tip of South America to get there via ship during a very long, hard journey. They would get there in California because of the promised prosperity after the gold rush, after gold was discovered in California in 1848, especially 1849. So many immigrants, but yeah, just Americans on the East Coast just making that journey to strike it rich. So the expansion, the more I think about the 1840s, the more impressive they are. Yeah, this is kind of crazy. All right. 1850s, though, I think is definitely B tier. 1850s, you essentially reach a point where now everybody hates each other in terms of North versus South. You have two distinct cultures. I made a whole video about this, about like just how different were the northern states from the southern states during the 1850s. It was actually quite dramatic. It really was. It already felt like two different countries in the 1850s before the Confederate States of America existed as a separate country. The decade begins with the Compromise of 1850. I was going to sing it, which, it was a good law, and the fact that it did the impossible. It kept the country together for another 10 years when it really didn't look like it was possible with how badly the debates were going. But a few key members of Congress were able to craft that, as controversial as it still remained, in particular the Fugitive Slave Act, part of the Compromise of 1850. But that was the only thing, kind of the little bit of glue that was holding the country together this entire decade. Political craziness. Yeah, you had dough-faced presidents mostly. You had Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, both of them really bad presidents. Northerners who did whatever they could to make Southerners happy, but not Northerners. You saw the rise of the Republican Party. The Republican Party becomes a thing in the mid-1850s, mostly as a response to the fact that the Whig Party had disintegrated. The Free Soil Party wasn't gaining much traction either. But then you also had others who were like, well, we need something new that just is more, that reaches out to for a broader voting block than just, pet issues. But still a very anti-slavery party, especially anti-expanding slavery out west. Abraham Lincoln, of course, famously is the first Republican elected as president. John C. Fremont was the first one to run back in 1856. But as far as laws, yeah, I mean, you have one of the worst laws in American history, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which causes bleeding Kansas to happen. That's the conflict craziness. Some people argue, myself included, that the Civil War really began in Kansas in the late 1850s because it was a precursor in many ways. It predicted what would come later on, instigated by those anti-slavery and pro-slavery folks rushing to come to Kansas to make it either a free state or slave state. Ultimately, Kansas was a free state, baby. And we know what happened after the 1850s, so that's something you can't ignore as well. All this was building up to it. You had Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe has got everybody riled up with that. That's the most popular book of the 1800s, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The only book that did better was the Bible, so that tells you a lot. You had Harriet Tubman that was helping slaves escape. Frederick Douglass was doing the circuit. He was an escaped slave himself, and he was a big-time celebrity by the 1850s. You had, in terms of economic craziness, it was just not a stable time, but nothing too notable, I would say. Cultural craziness, yeah, it's mainly just that divide between North and South. I mean, this literally broke apart families, long-held friendships. People that used to be close became bitter enemies purely on the issue of the expansion of slavery. The people that increasingly were saying, hey, no, we should keep the country together through the new compromises, increasingly were just viewed as out of touch and not really understanding how serious everything was. The Dred Scott decision, the worst Supreme Court decision in American history, that was 1857. Just so much building up in 1850s, like the war drums building up and leadership not doing anything after, especially the death of folks like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. So yeah, that's why 1850s are B tier. A lot of people mentioning Jimmy Carter in the chat. Yes, a lot of Jimmy Carter fans. Okay, I'll take another drink here before we move on to the S tier decade. Yep, 1860s. The craziest decade in American history was the 1860s, probably for obvious reasons. The American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in American history. Not only did more people die, more Americans died in that war by far than any other war in American history, but the single bloodiest day in American history, at the Battle of Antietam in 1862, just a devastating war that affected everyone. You could not escape this war. Even if you went out west, they were fighting it. Everywhere was just chaos. The war started in 1861 with the federal troops trying to retake Fort Sumter in South Carolina. You had shortly after, around this time, you had many states all of a sudden just say, nope, we're going to secede. I always have a hard time saying that word, secede from the Union. We're starting our own country, the Confederate States of America. That's why they call it the Civil War. And it was so bad that people realized this is the first time where you had guns that could actually, you didn't even have to be good at shooting them. They would hit the target, at least in close range. The technology had gotten better with guns and cannons. And now we had photography for the first time that was capturing the devastation, and people resisted being drafted into the war to a point where there was a famous draft riot in New York City. By 1863, for sure, you had lots of Americans that were not wanting to fight in this war, in particular in the North on the Union side. But just to summarize the most devastating war in American history, the Union troops did win after 700,000 Americans died. The Confederate States of America became no more. You had a bit of a reconciliation, a lot of pardoning of Confederate leaders and troops and everything. The country tried to heal with Reconstruction, is what we call that period, trying to reheal the country after the Civil War that lasted into the 1870s, which I'll cover next. You had three very important amendments added to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. Mostly everyone knows the 13th Amendment, which officially abolished slavery, except for prisoners. 14th Amendment, the most important amendment outside of the First Amendment and maybe the Second Amendment, in my opinion. 14th Amendment giving us the Equal Protection Clause, giving every American citizen equal opportunity under the law, equal protection under the law. Many Supreme Court cases later on would expand who that applied to, although originally was just meant for recently freed slaves. Speaking of recently freed slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, that's when Abraham Lincoln first declared all slaves in Confederate states free. After the 13th Amendment, the remaining states freed all their slaves. That's why we have Juneteenth. The final slaves have heard that they're free in 1865, but it doesn't mean that they were really free, if you know what I mean. So many of them struggled afterwards. They dealt with black codes and other forms of discrimination. Later on, Jim Crow laws. You had just systemic discrimination, and they couldn't buy anything. They couldn't buy real estate. They became essentially, effectively slaves, still sharecroppers in many cases. Extreme prejudice, racism that continued, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. By the end of the 1860s, Ulysses Grant was a president, the famous general during the Civil War whose leadership helped the Union win that war. And he fought back against the KKK, and he tried to make Reconstruction a little bit more strict to limit what Southern leaders were doing to African Americans in particular, with retaliation after the Civil War was over. But I cannot downplay the importance of the 1860s. Whenever you think about the present times and how crazy you think they are, I encourage you to just read one book about the 1860s in the United States. 1870s is obviously next up, but I'm only going to put it at D tier. And Reconstruction is still going on for the first few years of the 1870s, up until officially it ends January of 1877. You have, with the last remaining federal troops going back north. And then you all of a sudden see all these brand new Jim Crow laws, as they became known, to make racial discrimination institutionalized. So every public facilities built from that point forward in most southern states were segregated, even in some states that were not in the South. Segregated schools, segregated hospitals, segregated restrooms, even segregated water fountains, even movie theaters, even private institutions were even private stores were segregated after the 1870s. So that would fall under the political craziness, conflict craziness. 1876 was such a close election. The guy that won the most votes, who was for the Democratic Party, Samuel J. Tilden. Tilden was he got a lot of support from Southerners, and him losing the electoral vote by just one, and winning the popular vote was pretty controversial. And after that election in 1876, many people thought that we might be headed to a second civil war, folks. But fortunately, it was resolved with a compromise of 1877. That's why the federal troops went back to the north. Unfortunately, that led to a reactionary backwards time for African Americans in the South, which ultimately led to many of them, to flee the South and the Great Migration. Eventually, these things don't happen so quickly. But yeah, the country barely was sticking together. You also, I mean, in terms of economic craziness, I would say a lot of prosperity overall. But this is when you see more concentration of wealth start to gather with the so-called robber barons, the very wealthy folks who are consolidating power through their ability to buy up companies and to buy up supply lines. These are the first monopolies that formed during the 1870s. The first people that are affected negatively by this are the farmers. The railroad monopolies in particular really hurt the farmers. You had a lot of federal government money going to plutocrats, and so farmers began to organize. Later, it was unions that started to organize in the cities. By the 1880s, they had really joined forces more. And then you see the rise of the populist movement. Otherwise, there's most of the conflicts you see in the 1870s are out west with clashes with the last Native American nations that are resisting, that treaties have been broken, treaties that have been put in place in some cases for more than 100 years were broken by American settlers invading their land, and so they fought back. These Native American tribes, a lot of this kind of reached a height in the 1870s, and it was very tragic because more broken promises, and at this point you had way more Native Americans forced onto reservations, and many of them started to be forced to be assimilated, to give up their culture, which I made a video about recently. I was proud of that one. What else did I forget about 1870s? I probably forgot a lot here. This is all just off the top of my head, so I probably shouldn't have done this off the top of my head. I probably should have put some more effort into this, but regardless, I just think it's okay. I think I covered the big stuff for the 1870s. Yeah, I mean, I'm a little rusty because I haven't taught in the classroom for a while, but foreign policy is still kind of okay. Yeah, it's still not a whole lot going on in the 1870s. That dramatically changes with the 1890s, which I'm going to put the 1890s up next as a C tier, I think, or B tier. Sorry, B tier. Yeah, sorry, I'm looking at a different one here. So 1890s is B tier because you do have a lot going on. First of all, I mentioned the conflict craziness. Yeah, you have the Spanish-American War. You have the first time the United States is trying to be imperialist. They had just taken over Hawaii by force, a sovereign country that they just overthrew the Queen, and in cooperation with plutocrats. Speaking of plutocrats, this was the peak of the Gilded Age, and a lot of people upset by the fact that robber barons had just a handful of dudes basically controlled the vast majority of wealth in the country. And so you saw the populism movement rise against that in the 1890s. A very similar time to now, by the way. I bring this up a lot whenever people interview me. But back to the conflict, I mean, the Philippine-American War was more the 1900s, but I think just the fact that the United States thought, yeah, we can just take Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. They can be part of the United States, right? Because we're better anyway. We have the Constitution. We have the Bill of Rights. We have equal protection. So these people will just want to be part of the United States. They won't want to be their own country. In terms of, but still, conflict craziness was not as much, like especially on the home front. Okay, so Mrs. B keeps texting me here. She's saying, "Sun is going down. Do you need another light? Also, you need to fix your hair." Crap. I think I'm good with the light. How's my? Is that better? I think my hair's better. Okay. All right, back to this. 1890s, you had economic craziness for sure. Okay, you had the Long Depression, which really started in the 1870s, but got even worse in the 1890s with the Panic of 1893. You had just severe inflation compounded with severe unemployment. You had just wages were not going up anymore for those who did have jobs. And this is also explains a lot of why the populism movement got big. The populism movement originated, I made a video about this as well, but it originated in the Great Plains, Nebraska, Kansas, states like that, Missouri, Iowa. James Weaver from Iowa, he was the first Populist Party candidate to run for president in 1892, had a pretty good third-party showing. You had just ordinary people all rising together. They're putting aside their differences. And so it became more about looking up instead of looking over. And so that was a really special time in American history. In terms of the cultural craziness by the 1890s, you know, I mean, it's basically Victorian times, very conservative time in terms of culture. So there's not really too much being shaken up with culture, I would say. But society, yeah, people are questioning hierarchies, questioning why does that person have so much wealth and I have nothing, but I work 3 times as hard as that same person. That person was born into wealth. Why is it that we are working our butts off and we're still in poverty? So that's really the main thing we're talking about here in the 1890s. Political craziness, of course, you got a different party system that arises with the beginning of the progressive era. You have, surprisingly, William McKinley is elected president, but he's kind of the last of the pre-progressive era presidents because his running mate, though, is not he's definitely a progressive president. So after William McKinley is assassinated in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt will take over. But, you know, we're still talking about the 1890s here. So what put that into place was the fact that both the Democratic Party and Republican Party began to respond to concerns of the populace. They talked about more concerns about, we want inflation actually for these farmers they're not making any money. Maybe we should have lower tariffs. Tariffs have been historically really high up to that point in economic history. So stuff like that. I always bring up, maybe I'm a little biased because of the time we live in now, because I'm always comparing the 2020s to the 1890s. But I think the 1890s was a really dynamic time, a lot of things changing. And also what's really cool is you can go back and there's a lot of information. There's a lot of photographs and even video footage of this time. And you can just see how things are quickly changing. You know, you have cities especially that are starting to just become these places where you can just feel the energy that was not there before. And there was just no going back. But after that, there was no going back. And I really think the 1890s, you saw just a lot of stuff kind of getting ready to erupt. Just really, and that's also the 1890s. One final thought. Sorry, I'm talking so much about the 1890s. That was when the United States officially became the wealthiest country in the world. Okay, so now we're going to jumping ahead. And the 1900s are exciting too, but still F tier. So we're going to 1910s. Everybody knows, not everybody, but most people know 1910s was probably more exciting for the world as just instead of just like the United States. So that's why I'm putting it at way down to C tier. The United States obviously did fight in World War I, but it was not there, I would say, during the most crazy of the years of the war, 1914 through 1916. That's when the most death and destruction happened. But yeah, it would join the World War I in 1917. you had, and then the war ended within like a year and a half after that. As far as domestic conflict craziness, mostly I think people were getting along until 1919, until the end of World War I, when you saw a bunch of American soldiers that had fought in that war are coming back. And you just saw also a president, Woodrow Wilson, who was not really doing anything because he was incapacitated. His wife was trying to run things. And so if you ever want to explore the year 1919 more, there's a book. I can't remember the name of the book, but Cynical Historian did a video about the book. And it is one of the craziest years in American history. You have the rise of the first Red Scare. So all of a sudden people are freaking out about communism. You freaking out about anarchism, and anybody who is even remotely associated with communism or anarchism is seen as a pariah, as somebody to be marginalized and targeted. It was a true witch hunt. The more famous Red Scare took place in the 1950s or late 1940s, early 1950s, but the first Red Scare was also a pretty big deal. And that was 1918, 1919. Of course, after the Russian Revolution, a lot of Americans freaked out about that. And you had, of course, I would say a reactionary turn in terms of like, it just seemed like a lot more people were racist in the 1910s. Anti-Semitism was on the rise. Anti-Catholicism was on the rise. By 1920, the KKK had new life. The Birth of a Nation was one of the biggest blockbuster films. One of the first. This is also the first time where you have mass media, by the way, in terms of movies, radio. So that would be another cultural craziness thing about the 1910s. Although most people still couldn't afford a radio. Same thing you had with they were building roads because now people were buying these things called automobiles in the 1910s. They became a little bit more affordable, but still mostly wealthy folks owned them, but still dynamically affecting cities in particular, settlement patterns. In terms of political craziness, I already was touching on Woodrow Wilson a bit, but his suppression of speech, Sedition Act, not good. He threw Eugene Debs in prison, for example, Debs was trying to get people not to fight in World War I. Speaking of that, there were, I would say, some of the most dramatic anti-war protests that happened in American history were the anti-war protests that happened during the First World War. A lot of people did not want to fight in that war. A lot of people did not. Let's see what else is going on. I know Titanic 1912 is going on. I would say that as far as cultural craziness, though, you can start to see a little bit of what's going to happen in the 1920s. People starting to rebel a little bit. Yeah, breaking free of those conservative Victorian values. Economic craziness. Okay, well, yeah, the big deal. You had the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank, which to this day extremely influential in our lives, whether you realize it or not. The invention of the income tax, well, not invention, it was first implemented in the 1860s during the Civil War, but now it's part of the Constitution that there's an income tax. Progressive era is in full swing. It's mainstream now by this time. Women get the right to vote, but it's not going to go into effect until the 1920s, but still they finally get the right to vote in 1919. It was a long struggle for women, but finally, you also have prohibition. A lot of people calling for banning alcohol during the 1910s, and it comes to, and that does happen by the end of the decade. In terms of other social things, though, I would say mostly it's just kind of a time where I think the decade began with like so much hope and optimism, but by the end of it, people are very doomer. And that's where we get the lost generation, that whole generation of people that lived through World War I as young people. So between the ages of 10 and 25, if you're experiencing World War I, even on the home front, you see like, oh, wow, this sucks. Is the world going to end? We can end it now, can't we? This is actually possible. We could all just kill ourselves with violence through warfare. So yeah, that's a big change in the 1910s. All right, before we get to the 1920s, I'm going to take another drink here, and I'm going to check out the super chats. Like I said, if you have questions about Jimmy Carter, I'll try to focus more on that at the very end of this stream. I already got this one, I think, right? I reckon the 1980s are probably a very significant era, like Cold War ending, etc. Yes, yes. Teddy says, I know it's too early, but so far, would you put the 2010s above or below the 2020s? I would put it below the 2020s already, because I think the 2010s were pretty chill. I really do. And thank you for all the super chats, by the way. You're all like paying your hard-earned dollars on this. In some cases, other currency, but thank you for that. Pounds. Justin and Zoe, not going to lie, 1920s is the most craziest. Oh, I'm about to rank them. Let's see where I put them. Cyvlog again. Speaking of the Jacksonian era, who was the last Jacksonian president? Andrew Johnson, perhaps? I would say that's a safe, yeah. He was heavily influenced by Andrew Jackson for sure. He liked Andrew Jackson. But yeah, after that, yeah, that might be. I mean, Harry Truman was a big fan of Andrew Jackson. V-Man, Mr. B, did you know when the U.S. took over Puerto Rico, they tried to wipe out its culture and language? I did know that. That's why it's a commonwealth today. Enough separation to preserve cultural identity, but still have ties for money and defense. This is why so many people in Puerto Rico do not want to become the 51st state. They have polls and they have votes on referendums on this. The last couple referendums, I think barely more Puerto Ricans wanted to become a state, join the country officially for representation purposes than not. But it's a debate that has been happening for a very long time. And a big reason why those folks that don't want to join, this is the same argument, by the way, that they make in Guam and other U.S. territories, is because of what you're mentioning there, V-Man. Thanks for bringing that up. Thanks for the super chat. The Oshawott King says, I heard the news. Rest in peace, Jimmy Carter, and respect for him and his family, politics aside. Yes, rest in peace. Crazy decades to end this crazy year. Carter, yeah, and the decade is officially half over here in a few days. 5 years of the 2020s. That's why I wanted to do this now. Also, I'm going to do a separate stream where I'm going to look at the most influential events in American history so far this century as well, because we are about to be a quarter done with this century. If although I know technically the century doesn't begin until 2001. I get it, but come on. Mr. Beat, I'm pretty sure that JC didn't die. Hoax. What? You're blowing my mind. This is why I tend to avoid breaking news. Back to the tier list for all the craziest decades in American history. All right. Oh, I missed a super chat. 1910s was legit pure chaos. World War I, Spanish flu. Oh, I forgot to mention the Spanish flu. It was a crazy time to be alive. But yeah, the Spanish flu was a pandemic that was much worse than the COVID-19 pandemic. Way more people died from the Spanish flu during World War I than people who died from the actual fighting during World War I, for example. But now we're going to the 1920s, and I'm going to go 1920s B tier. And this is mostly because of the cultural craziness. Cultural, okay? Think The Great Gatsby came out in 1925. I think one of the quickest ways to learn about the 1920s is to read F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic book, The Great Gatsby. If you don't like reading, just watch one of the movies. They're all decent, especially the most recent ones, really good visual effects. Anyway, a lot of the art from this time kind of demonstrates it well. If you learn about the flappers, if you learn about these weird contests they had, I have a video about all these trends, these cultural trends that were happening in the 1920s. Women were being more scandalous with the way they dressed. Was really what? They were showing their knees. You had a lot of people now. The 1920s was the first time you have more Americans living in cities than on farms. That alone is a huge freaking deal. You have more people now own radios for the first time. Radios become affordable. You're not just staring at each other now or reading books like for entertainment, or what are they doing? What do they call it? Touch grass or something? No, you are just all gathered around the radio, listening to shows on the radio. I'm not talking about like NPR or something like that. NPR didn't exist yet. You had more and more people could now afford automobiles thanks to the invention of the Model T, a big deal that, this is one reason why I think we should have BYD EVs in the United States, but those dang tariffs. I digress. A lot of abbreviations there. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, also electrification. Even if you lived in a rural area, now you had electricity for the first time, finally, by the 1920s. Because of mass media now becoming much more pervasive, you had so many more people that were like all talking about the same things. And so you saw actually, strangely, like the country becoming way more united in the 1920s. But also because of that, being more connected, they became more open to new things. It's weird because you also think of the 1920s as this time as like, oh, xenophobia, a rise of like this reactionary movement of the KKK, for example, became bigger than ever before in the 1920s. But they were mostly just anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish by that time, anti-African American. But yeah, immigrants, immigrants had been coming to the country for a long time, for several decades. You also have restrictions against immigration in the 1920s, in particular in 1924 quota systems to limit how many people come to the United States that are not coming from Northern or Western Europe. So that's kind of goes counter to what I just said. I mean, both are true, but overall, though, more and more people are just becoming a little bit more individualistic and realizing that, hey, it's okay to be different. Economic craziness. I mean, it's called the Roaring 20s, mostly because the economy is just roaring right along. It's doing pretty well, mostly for the wealthy, but still doing pretty well overall. More and more people can afford appliances, for example, in the home, a refrigerator, for crying out loud. Farmers, though, aren't doing so well, especially by the late 1920s. This is also kind of like I was talking about earlier with the 1850s being something that's kind of hinting at what's to come with the Great Depression. The farmers got hit first with, again, you had deflation. They weren't making as much money. They were not able to, they had less land to produce stuff. And then, crops were they weren't as plentiful as before by this time. I'm just generally speaking here. In terms of conflict craziness, it wasn't too bad, actually. We were watching what was happening around the world. For sure, things are kind of getting a little scary in certain parts of the world. But I'm mostly talking about the cultural craziness. Political craziness, you had mostly Republicans in power the whole decade. Republicans who wanted to limit the power of government. In particular, presidents who's like, no, presidents have too much power. Calvin Coolidge is the best example we have of this. He thought the president should have less power. The government should be less involved with everything, especially the economy, but everything. So, this is a time where I do think that with government kind of like backing off a little bit, everybody else shines. Sadly, when government does intervene, it's a little bit xenophobic. So that's not a good part about the 1920s. But hey, women can vote now. Also, the weird something I didn't bring up is the whole 1920s is the thing that's kind of like counter to all of American history that we associate with 1920s. Prohibition is in effect this entire decade. So it is illegal to consume, to transport, to manufacture alcohol. People do it anyway. There's bootleggers, there's speakeasies. It's a lot of that still going on. Just a really interesting decade to learn about. If you ever have anyone who's not into history, try to find something 1920s based and say, hey, check this out. That's what I always say. All right, moving on to 1930s. 1930s, I think, is also B tier, and the reason why it's not A tier is because I think that in many ways the United States kind of hit the pause button because of the Great Depression. The Great Depression technically began in 1929, the end of 1929, but really it wasn't really a depression until the early 1930s, when you had unemployment as high as 25%, when you had year after year the economy just shrinking, like literally shrinking. Each year, despite the population going up, there was less being produced. That's something that doesn't happen very often in American history, and this happened the entire decade. Even when they started to make a little bit of progress, it was only temporary. So even as late as 1939, the Great Depression was still going on, and it still sucked for a lot of Americans. Worldwide, a lot more is going on with conflicts, okay? The United States is just trying to focus on itself, America first time, because they are just trying to get out of the Depression. And that's also why I think it's a big deal with the political craziness of the 1930s, is because the response to the Great Depression was, of course, mostly New Deal programs put into place by Franklin Roosevelt and his allies in Congress. They were able to pass so much legislation that had so much wide-ranging impact. Unbelievable. To this day, things we take for granted all started in the 1930s, such as overtime pay, a federal minimum wage, the idea that, hey, we work Monday through Friday, we have weekends. Weekends are a thing. Social Security for those who can no longer work when they retire. For those who are disabled, for those who lost the breadwinner in the family and they depend on that income. That was a big freaking deal. And today, that's something that's one of the most sacred things, Social Security. All these New Deal programs that attempted to, in many cases, they did actually create jobs to get people income because the Depression was so bad. It was just something. I would say overall, the New Deal did not really end the Depression. It really didn't do a whole lot, but it created this whole idea of modern liberalism in the country, where you have the government should have a role, not necessarily to run things, but to just provide a safety net. The whole idea of a safety net became a thing in the 1930s, such as things like public housing. The government should provide aid for those who can't afford to have a home. Roosevelt said famously that, there are certain things that are rights that we've never said they're rights, but they are rights. We know they're rights. Your right to not be hungry, to have shelter, to have access to clean drinking water, stuff like this. But yeah, unemployment relief. I already mentioned Social Security. The other thing that's really big about the 1930s New Deal is regulations. This all started during the Progressive era, but it really expanded under Roosevelt, because of you had an executive branch that was actually being proactive and making sure that no shenanigans were going on, especially in financial markets. Financial markets became heavily regulated, and so a lot of those shenanigans were just kind of destroyed because of the New Deal initiatives. Okay, so now we're going to an A tier again. Yeah, no doubt. The 1940s. 1940s are A tier because this is when the biggest war in world history took place. It actually began in the 1930s, but for the United States, it began in the 1940s. We're talking about World War II, of course. And the United States got involved after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Hawaii, December of 1941, and we quickly mobilized, unified actually, very little resistance to this war. Everybody was unified, especially to fight the Japanese. Speaking of the Japanese, a lot of racism against the Japanese. Many were forced onto internment camps, which I call concentration camps. Not good. One of the darkest legacies of Roosevelt, who is still president, believe it or not, multiple decades. And he was president for most of the 1930s. It's just mind-blowing to think about. Anyway, I see... Oh, I thought I saw something else. Okay, yeah, so World War II, United States, that's only next to the Civil War did more Americans lose their lives fighting in that war. There are still World War II veterans alive. I encourage you, if you ever hear of one anywhere near you, you should go see them and thank them for their service and talk to them. Hopefully they can have conversations with you about their experience, but many of them are older than 100 at this point. Not very many, just a few thousand left here in the United States. It was the war where it was pretty clear there was good guys and bad guys. You had fascists on one side, you had freedom fighters on the other side. I mean, most people agree. It was pretty easy to see that Hitler was a bad guy, that Mussolini was a bad guy, that Stalin was a bad guy. Oh, wait, but Stalin is, he needs to be on our team to defeat the other bad guys. But you know what I mean. Soviet Union, together with the United States, were able to defeat Nazi Germany. Japan came a few months later. Another big moment of the 1940s was the first and only time that nuclear weapons were dropped on people in world history. And that was, of course, the decision that Truman made to end World War II because Japan was refusing to surrender. They surrendered after that. For the rest of the 1940s, more nuclear testing, fallout, people that were harmed by that, we found out later on. Not good stuff. But those first 1941 to 1945, it was just everything revolved around the war. Everything revolved around defeating Hitler and defeating Japan. After like the late 1940s, everything was focused on rebuilding those defeated, rebuilding Germany, rebuilding Italy, rebuilding Japan, the Marshall Plan, direct federal aid. In my view, one of the best decisions the federal government ever made was to, instead of punish who we defeated, you help them. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again. We learned our lesson from the first time when you punished Germany after World War I. We're not going to punish them again. We actually learned history to not repeat the same mistakes of the past. Also, late 1940s, I mean, in terms of conflict craziness, I mean, you think that, hey, the worst war in world history, World War II, you think that would have like made it so that no one wanted to go to war ever again, but nope. Yeah, just a few years later, all of a sudden, Soviet Union's like trying to get up in everybody's business. And so we're like, what the heck? Will we form a NATO, a military alliance that's still in place today? And in response, eventually the Soviet Union forms the Warsaw Pact. But yeah, the allies of the Soviet Union are not quite fully on board with the Soviet Union. They don't like to be bossed around by the Soviet Union. And then by the end of the 1940s, you already see what's going to happen on the Korean Peninsula. In the Korean War, the United States gets involved with that in 1950. In terms of political craziness, 1948 election is a pretty interesting. Obviously, Harry Truman wins it, but he had only gotten into power because last minute he was chosen as the vice president of Franklin Roosevelt, who dies just a few months after he was elected for a fourth term. And so Harry Truman has to end the war. And Harry Truman has to make all these huge decisions all in a short amount of time. That Harry Truman video I made, by the way, I feel like I did it not enough justice by just how much he had to worry about in those few months, just right after the war ended. Just so much going on at the end of the war to make sure that, okay. And, you know, it didn't go all very, wasn't all groovy. But you did quickly see the beginning of the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine just said, hey, anytime the Soviet Union is trying to spread communism, really, he was more afraid of spreading authoritarianism. That was really, but they called it communism. Said, hey, we're going to help out those fighting communism. We're going to give them military and economic aid. You had the Iron Curtain. You had mutually assured destruction. Really scary time. The rise of the Second Red Scare that I mentioned earlier. The creation of the United Nations, which is still in place today. Yeah, a lot of stuff's going down in the 1940s. I'm probably missing stuff now. I'm starting to get tired. But what did I miss about the 1940s? It's an A-tier decade. An A-tier decade. Somebody just said 1840s should be S. Noah. 1840s S. Come on. Osbers this year. Yes, I'm going to do a live stream tomorrow about Jimmy Carter and his legacy. I need to gather my thoughts. I only found out that he had passed away just like a few moments before going live here. So, thank you, Hi. The creation of Israel, India, and Pakistan becoming nations. Bangladesh. Yeah, so much going on worldwide. But again, this is about American history, so maybe we shouldn't. But yeah, we were the first country, thanks to Truman, the first country to recognize Israel as an independent country, a sovereign country. Okay, we're jumping ahead to the 1960s. I know the 1950s, there's a lot going on, but most of it's like, when I think of the 1950s, I'm mostly thinking about stability and calm. A lot of the craziness was happening, but in secret, we didn't know about it. So I'm jumping ahead to the 1960s because I think 1950s would be F tier. 1960s is, in my view, A tier. And I'm also maybe biased because I'm just most fascinated to teach and learn about the 1960s. It's always the decade I'm most interested in. That in the 1970s, just so much happening. First, the political craziness, lots of political assassinations, starting with John F. Kennedy, 1963, Malcolm X, a couple years later, Martin Luther King Jr., 3 years after that, Robert F. Kennedy assassinated, running for president that same year. You had other political assassinations. Those are just a few. You had, in terms of the two major political parties, the Democrats and Republicans, mostly actually were still kind of part of that New Deal coalition. But then you started to see a pretty significant branch of the Republican Party start to break away. And that was more, I would say, traditional and a little bit more racist. And so you saw a big reactionary movement to all of the New Deal coalition in the 1960s, especially with the rise of George Wallace, who later would also be shot when he ran for president again. That was 1972. Okay. In terms of the Cold War, holy crap! Yeah. Excuse me. All right, so I would say the most tense moments of the Cold War took place during the 1960s. You had the Bay of Pigs that happened right when Kennedy took over as president at the beginning, 1961. You had most famously the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which World War III almost happened, in 1962. You had basically tensions rising between the Soviet Union and the United States overall, I would say. JFK dies. You have LBJ, who's focused more on domestic stuff in the beginning, gets the Civil Rights Act passed, a big freaking deal, big law. The Voting Rights Act passed the year after that. Later on, laws for more to increase the safety net, basically. So just we have the creation of Medicaid, Medicare. That's a big deal. Public health insurance for senior citizens, and also those in poverty. Lyndon Johnson starts his war on poverty. Other initiatives like public housing, expanding public housing at the federal level, trying to reverse systemic racism for the first time, ending poll taxes. Just the civil rights movement overall, like it started really in the 1940s. But really, the civil rights movement just reaching a peak, especially with the influence of Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s, cannot downplay that at all. It's such a big deal because it got white people on board. That's where the change happened. And that wouldn't have happened without folks like Martin Luther King Jr. So all these laws that are passed, the cultural craziness of the 1960s. Listen to a song that came out in 1960, your average song, like Google Billboard Hot 100, December 1960, listen to those songs, then do the same thing, but Google Billboard Hot 100, 1970, December 1970, and you're going to hear wildly different music. So many changes in art during the 1960s. A big influence really from the Beatles, the British invasion, other British bands like the Kinks and the Rolling Stones, the psychedelic movement, psychedelia, just, I would say you couldn't escape it by the end of the 1960s in all forms of music. The creation of new genres of music like heavy metal, the rise of Motown becoming something that was the most profitable form of music in the world. So things like that, like the culture changes. I would say Woodstock is probably the easiest way to quickly see how things had changed when you compare, especially like hairstyles and clothing styles. The movements to liberate everything in terms of like birth control became socially acceptable in the 1960s. Birth control. Before that, it was taboo. There was even a Supreme Court case, Griswold v. Connecticut. You saw drug use skyrocket, especially with psychedelics, but all types of drugs. And this led to like a lot of people freaking out about this trend. But I haven't even got to the other craziness, economic craziness. Okay, things were actually economically pretty darn good most of the 1960s. A little bit of inflation at the end of the 1960s that started to kind of worry people. But really the conflict craziness, I mentioned the Cold War already, but in terms of like the Cold War heating up, I mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis. The space race is going on. NASA had been created by 1960. And we send a man to space in 1962. We sent a man to the moon in 1969. We will go to the moon and we will do the other things. 1960s, holy crap. The equivalent of trillions of dollars pumped into NASA. No restrictions for R&D. You just do whatever you can to beat the Russians to space and to the moon. And we did it. Some of you think we didn't, but I think we. Some people are arguing S tier here. Maybe it should be S tier. Also, the Vietnam War is the biggest conflict I think the United States is dealing with, beginning in 1960, really the whole decade, but really escalating in 1966 in particular, 1967, the Tet Offensive, 1968. We have more and more troops by the end of the 1960s in Vietnam than anywhere else. And it's not going well. We thought we would defeat them. Didn't go so well. Back home, people are protesting. Some of the largest protests, anti-war protests we've ever seen in this country. Although I would say big ones happened in more recent years too. But yeah, mostly on college campuses. People resisting the draft, even going to Canada to resist the draft, bring their draft cards. The Vietnam War was the first war that kind of changes our perception of global dominance and like, hey, we can't even take out this country here and supposedly is a weak country. And why are we even doing this to begin with? Is it really to fight communism, or is it really to just exploit their resources? Also, what about the war crimes? The horrible things American soldiers we've seen them do. Things are covered up. My Lai massacre. You have what's happening in Cambodia and Laos and chemical warfare, all of the things that we thought the United States troops would never do, and it's revealed they did it. The American government covered it up. The Pentagon Papers are released. This is the first time by the end of the 1960s where you have a sizable number of Americans that are just, for the first time, they just do not trust the government anymore. You had lots of trust in the government before this time, not beginning with the Vietnam War, especially in the later stages of the war, which it wouldn't end until a few years after the 1960s. It just kept going, even though Nixon won the election of 1968, partially because he promised to bring the troops home from Vietnam. Someone mentioned Charles Manson and the CIA. Yeah, this is the decade of Charles Manson. You have race riots that are happening. Okay, especially after the death of Martin Luther King Jr., you have riots across the country erupting. Just they're tired of the systemic racism. They feel like they're still not being heard. The Civil Rights Act wasn't enough, or it's too little, too late. Definitely a rise in crime, a rise in instability. 1968 alone, I mean, you look at what was happening outside of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, pure madness, pure madness. Jimi Hendrix dies. Yeah. There's just so much. Okay, yeah, University of Alabama, Ole Miss racially integrate, but government forces them to in 1962, 1963. That's right. Forrest Gump was there. Forrest Gump was there. A lot of people are saying I should have done S tier for 1960s. It's close. I don't know. It's just tough for me to put it all the way up there. Okay, but now we're at the 1970s. I already hinted at some of this, but yeah, 1970s, I think, is probably best to be. Yeah, I went back and forth. What should I do? I think really not. It's a D tier. I really think it is. I used to think C tier, but the more I think about it, I think I'm just biased because it's recency bias. I really think the 1970s was really just kind of like still trying to catch our breath from the craziness of the 1960s. I mentioned the Vietnam War. It finally did end by 1975. American troops are just kicked out of there. You had the Watergate scandal as far as political craziness, the first and only president to resign, Richard Nixon, because of that scandal. You had increasingly distrust in the federal government with the Watergate scandal, and Congress tries to heal these wounds because it passes a series of laws to hold the federal government more accountable. Nixon, Nixon was very influential, especially in the 1970s before he got out of office. Those 1970 through 1973 in particular were very productive years for Richard Nixon. Détente as foreign policy with opening up trade with China, relaxing tensions with the Soviet Union to make the Cold War not so warm anymore. I would say the political craziness also with like a bunch of laws that were passed that were still part of that New Deal coalition. A lot of environmental laws like the Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, creation of the EPA, but also, the Controlled Substances Act, the war on drugs began, which really escalated in the 1980s. Cultural craziness was really, I think, just as crazy as 1960s. It just kind of took it to the next level with the invention of new genres of music like punk rock and hip hop. You had really just a thriving arts scene, a lot of exciting things happening. Began in the 1960s, but really went up to the next level in the 1970s. Cultural craziness is like, think about how people dressed in the 1970s. Wacky clothing styles, stuff that you had never seen before and you rarely see since. Or if you do, you see it like people trying to get attention. The people, everyone had giant hair. You had, I would say, as far as economic craziness, there's no doubt stagflation was the big thing that was crazy. The oil shortages because of the embargoes by Middle Eastern countries made it so that gasoline was too expensive. And you had extremely high inflation, also high unemployment, which we call stagflation. Let's see, conflict craziness. The United States is still around the world trying to overthrow certain governments that were pro-communist. I would say one of the biggest geopolitical events is the Iranian hostage crisis, American hostages in Iran, which Jimmy Carter had to deal with, was not able to free them until the very end of his presidency. You had, I think generally though, when we think about the 1970s, somebody just said hangover decade from the 60s. I kind of like that, D's. Yeah. But it was just kind of like, okay, you also saw a rise of a reaction to the 1960s and 1970s with the, I would say, the moral majority. So after the legalization of federally of abortion, Roe v. Wade was 1973. You saw kind of like a lot of people organized, especially Christians, especially Catholics, saying, hey, we need to start an anti-abortion movement, pro-life movement. And that eventually the Republicans were like, yeah, we'll take that as part of our platform. You saw a rise of they were trying to get an amendment to the Constitution for gender equality because 1970s feminism was still going pretty dang strong until kind of the conservative backlash against it. But the ERA amendment, you still had I would say progress for women in terms of like new laws to protect women, especially women that in marriages, trying to end discrimination towards women with sports. They could play sports in school for the first time in the 1970s. They couldn't face discrimination for getting pregnant, stuff like that. So I think it was still a lot of progress for women in the 1970s. They just fell a little bit short with not getting that amendment passed. Let's see, what else am I missing here? We mentioned the Camp David Accords was a big deal. Speaking of Jimmy Carter, yeah. Okay, I feel like I'm losing steam here. 1970s though, D tier. Okay, let's go now with 1980s. Now I'm Alive. I'm going to put it up to a B tier. The reason why I say B tier is because, again, like the 1960s, the Cold War heated up, and there were some times where it seemed like, there would be nuclear annihilation. It seemed like the world would be ending, especially in those early years of Ronald Reagan's presidency. However, what a flip of the script, what a turn of events. By the end of the decade, you saw the end of the Cold War and relations not completely, but mostly healed with the Soviet Union. In fact, you saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, and all these new countries are forming at the end of the 1980s. By 1991, the Soviet Union has completely collapsed, and it's a lot happens in a very short amount of time. The Berlin Wall falls, 1989. So the Reagan years are mostly known, I think, for more stability on the home front, a better economy. Inflation finally starts to go down by 1984. Inflation is no longer a worry. And unemployment goes really low. A lot of people are making a lot of money. However, this is the beginning of kind of a new era where there's less regulation and union membership dramatically declines. There's like a chilling effect after Reagan fires all those air traffic controllers who went on strike. And yeah, union membership dramatically declined after beginning in the 1980s. The war on drugs escalated. So you saw more systemic racism. So people of color were more negatively affected by that. I would say in terms of conflict craziness, you still had a lot of, the invasion of Grenada. You saw a little bit of interference still with coups by the United States, but it wasn't happening quite as much as it had in previous decades, especially compared to the 50s and 60s. Everybody was always thinking about the Soviet Union, but once that was over, like the United States was the only superpower left, baby. And that's a big deal. I think it's still the biggest accomplishment of Reagan was being able to end the Cold War, and that happened in the 1980s. Somebody mentioned the Challenger exploding. Yep, I have a video about that. That was in 1986. Guns N' Roses. The 1990s didn't make this list. It was just too boring of a decade. I love the 1990s. That's my formative years. That's when I grew up, became a man. But no, it's just, too boring to make this tier list. Not crazy enough, okay? Did I miss anything from the 1980s, though? Shoot, I feel like I did. Because I'm just rattling this stuff off the top of my head. So I feel like I'm missing, the AIDS epidemic. That was something that really scared people during the 1980s. Really scared people. Yeah. Let me know in the farm crisis. Okay. Let me know if there's anything else I missed in the chat. And we're going to end it with the 2000s. I think the 2000s are. I go back and forth between. Honestly, it could be anywhere from A to C. And I'm trying to recognize my bias because I lived through the 2000s and I remember them well, even though it was 20 years ago, less than that if you want to go to 2009. But yeah, a lot that really did happen. And I think a lot of things that we don't bring up enough. And so I'm going to explain that now. I'm going to go ahead and put it at A tier. You know what, though? Then it's right next to the 1960s and doesn't look very... All right, fine. I'll put it at B tier as well. All right, so 2000s was B tier because, first of all, the war on terrorism, which began in response to the 9/11 attacks, which I made a whole video about that as well, about my personal experience with it and how I processed it. Yeah, it was just something weird to live through, and I'll never forget it. But yeah, it really changed the global dynamic. And after that, ever since, really, even to this day, in almost 2025, we're still fighting the war on terrorism. People don't realize it. The war on terrorism is still technically going. The National Authorization to Use Force, AUMF, military force, put into place in response to 9/11, gave the president broad powers to just do whatever they had to send troops to find terrorist threats. A lot of loose interpretation there. It gave the president a lot of power, a lot of freedom to just send troops wherever they wanted to in the name of fighting terrorism or terror. And yeah, I think George W. Bush got a little carried away with it. First sending troops to Afghanistan, which was understandable because, Al-Qaeda, that was where their base was. Al-Qaeda was responsible for 9/11. That's where they thought Osama bin Laden was hanging out. They didn't find him until several years later, 2011, I believe. And he was not in Afghanistan. He was in Pakistan. But, you had the war in Afghanistan being the longest war in American history, not ending until 2021. So a 20-year-long war. The Iraq War, though, I think heavily overshadowed it. Much more controversial war. War protests, anti-war protests that happened. Not as big as Vietnam War protests, but I would say up there. The biggest reason why I think is not as many people. There wasn't a draft this time. So that means like young men did not have to fight in this war. I was in college at the time when it happened. Most people in college hated this war, thought it was unjustified. However, at the time, a lot of people supported it. They thought, hey, we're fighting terrorism. Saddam Hussein is a terrorist, yada, yada. I made a video about that as well. Okay, so the Iraq War, you have ISIS later on. That's a whole separate war. The war in Iraq is what historians are now calling that. I've mentioned all the global stuff. What about domestic stuff? Political craziness is not quite as much. I would say George W. Bush, I think he tried to avoid controversy for the most part. There are exceptions. I mean, he was a social conservative. He still is a social conservative. Cultural craziness. I mean, we began the decade with Jackass and nu metal, and we ended it with Tim and Eric. I think some of the craziest stuff by the end of the 2000s, I call them the aughts. The aughts. The end of the aughts, I think things are starting to get really crazy, especially with the fact that now the internet, social media is in full storm. So yeah, this is the other thing I want to talk about with cultural craziness. At the beginning of the aughts, we did not have social media. We didn't even have Friendster. Well, maybe Friendster was starting out, but we didn't have MySpace. We didn't have the Facebook, as they called it when it first was launched in 2004. We didn't even have YouTube. Like most of you are watching this on YouTube right now. It didn't exist until 2005. The smartphone didn't exist. That became a thing with the invention of the iPhone. I believe that was 2007. Most people by the end of the aughts couldn't afford an iPhone, but they got Blackberries. They were almost there, okay? But within a few years, everybody had iPhones, or if you were smarter, you had an Android. That's what I have. So we had the rise of social media is, I think, one of the biggest transformations in American history. We were fairly unified as a country, despite the controversial election of 2000, which Bush v. Gore, that was the one where the Supreme Court had to jump in to stop the recount. But I think overall, we were more united than what I think we realized in the aughts. I think it was really, a lot of the divisions came because of how information was getting to us via social media. And that really picked up steam in the 2010s. The aughts is when it started. And YouTube in itself, I think, is one of the most revolutionary forces ever in terms of like some of the most groundbreaking art that's happening right now is on this very platform, not by me, but others who are pushing the boundaries. They're not pushing them in the mainstream. You're not seeing that on network television or cable television, for crying out loud. Speaking of cable television, that was still big in the aughts, but quickly losing influence to the internet. I just think internet culture peaked in the aughts. And I think me being alive back then, some of it's nostalgia, but other parts of me was like, yeah, I think a lot of the internet was really legitimately better back then because less corporations had such a grasp over it. There was less consolidation of power that controlled the internet. Today, just a handful of companies control most of the internet, at least, the internet that we typically know. I'm not talking about the dark web here. Okay. So yeah, that's why, what else? Economic craziness. There was the Great Recession. That was before the COVID-19 pandemic and that recession. That's the only other major recession that happened in the 21st century so far. There was the dot-com recession like early on, but I think it pales in comparison to the Great Recession. The Great Recession is when I had gone back to school to become a teacher. I was trying to find a job in 2009 when there was no jobs. Like for every social studies teacher position open, there were 150 applicants. And so it was really tough. I could only find a job as a substitute teacher in a inner city school district. It was really hard for a lot of people. Unemployment was really high. And the government bailed out a lot of people, kind of a little bit of help for people. Mostly, though, they just bailed out corporations and those too big to fail corporations. And this led to a backlash. So when we talk about political craziness, a lot of this political craziness didn't really start until 2011, 2012, especially after the Citizens United decision, which was 2010, I think. You saw the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was short-lived, but I think a big deal, and the Tea Party movement. Those, I think, would not have happened if not for all the crazy stuff that was happening with the Great Recession, where governments just like around the world, not just the United States, they're just like, yeah, we're mostly just going to bail out industry and multinational corporations. It was really disheartening for a lot of Americans it doesn't matter where they were on the political spectrum, left or right, or anywhere in between. And so that's why you saw a backlash. And I think ever since we've seen it get worse. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing now in the 2020s. What else did I leave? The disastrous No Child Left Behind. Yeah, I'm going to make a video about that one of these days. I've not made about it yet. Yeah, Obama becomes the first African-American president, 2008. A big reason, though, why he was able to get in there and win so easily was because the country was really struggling economically in 2008. We forget how bad it was with the subprime mortgage crisis that started. A lot of people lost their homes, and they lost everything. I would say it was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The pandemic was rough, but that was only a couple of months really where it was really bad. Where would I put the 2010s? I would say F tier at this point, but it could go up if, 2020s, I would say it's so far halfway through the 2020s. I would say at least probably C tier. But I think after it's all said and done, I really firmly believe that the 2020s are going to be up there to the A tier. I have a feeling things are going to get even crazier the second half of the 2020s. But the 2010s, a lot of social progress. You saw legalization of same-sex marriage. You saw a raise in awareness of transgender rights. But then now we're living through the reaction to that, but still, I mean, what other decades? What other ones that I missed? Just name a decade and I'll tell you. But that's it. I don't want to talk too much. I've already been going for almost 2 hours. It's getting dark outside already, sadly. I have some other super chats I want to get to. Thanks for being here tonight. The Wall Street crash did cause the beginning of the Great Depression, technically, yes. I did. This is not a sponsor, okay? I just drink them anyway. I hope this is not true monarch music, but it's certainly looking that way. Okay, I want to make sure I get to the super chats because you donated money and I appreciate you so much. Where did I leave off? Oshawott King. I also considered 1920s as the foreshadowing era. Oh, well, thank you, Chikini. Thank you very much. 1960s, okay, maybe it will be S tier the more I think about it, but I hate putting more than the 1860s in S tier. Oh, thank you. This extra credit for you, Chickeny. Harrison's here. The Harrison. I argued with a colleague the other day. 1960s was the second most chaotic decade behind the 1860s. Don't let me down. Oh, okay, you're right. You're right. I didn't put it in S, but you're right. That's crazy that you argue. No wonder you watch my channel. Oh my gosh. Rest in peace, Carter. Yes. And again, if you're just now joining me, I'm going to do a special live stream to look at the legacy of Jimmy Carter tomorrow. I just learned of his passing about an hour before I went live today, so I didn't have time to prepare to respond to that. And Stanislav Petrov. Okay. Dan the Man, the legend. Oh, it's Chris. Would you do a video about the dangers of voting for a candidate in an election based solely on one issue? That is, people who vote on a candidate just on their stand on one issue only. Yeah, the example I always immediately think of is the abortion issue, because that's most of my family. They vote only on abortion. Millions of Americans still only vote on abortion. It blows my mind. But yeah, I think that's a great idea, Chris. I think I should explore it more, because if it does blow my mind, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I need to learn more about why this is. I mean, I understand, like, I was raised to be pro-life. I understand all of their arguments, and I share a lot of the sentiments. I understand where they're coming from wholeheartedly, but there's other examples. Like, there were people that voted on one issue in the 1890s, the prohibition or the temperance movement back then. They voted on one issue, which was to ban alcohol. So, it's not just abortion. You, sir, are what's known as a Grenada. Okay. Thanks, buddy. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you checked. Oh my gosh, look at these longtime viewers of the channel. I love you all. Will from Exploring History, check out his channel. It's a phenomenal channel. I learned about Carter from you. Oh my gosh, you learned about the news. Sorry to break that news to some. I'm not meant to. I'm supposed to be a history channel, not a breaking news channel. The Plan of Us. George W. Bush is worse than his father, as POTUS. I would agree with that. I think George H.W. Bush, or George Bush Sr., was actually a pretty decent president. I would say maybe the best president in my lifetime, dare I say. Doesn't mean he was perfect. There were certainly issues with him, but I think overall he was an effective leader. Okay, I think we're caught up with the super chats now. Can't wait for the 2060s. That's right, Caden. Will I make it to the 2060s? I hope so. Yeah, I mean, the main thing is, like, if you are having strong feelings about what's happening this year or this decade, just know that things can change quickly. Things actually will change so much that you'll look back on 2024 and you'll be like, why were we all freaking out back then? What was the point? I mean, that's one of the best parts about learning history is that it just forces me to constantly zoom out and look at the big picture and realize that in the end, usually everything's going to be fine. Or if it's not going to be fine, I'm not going to live to see it. It's just going to be my grandchildren. Who cares about my grandchildren, right? No. Yeah. So anyway, I hope I'm still making videos in the 2060s, but I'm going to have to stay alive. Any time travelers in the chat? Yes. Well, thanks for being here. We are, hey, Dylan, we're in a Gilded Age. We've been in a new Gilded Age at least since the aughts. It's just, anyway, thank you for the kind words. So far, time can only go forward. We can find a way to time travel. My nose is whistling. I'm sorry about that. If you're hearing a whistling note. Okay, I'm going to end it. I think I'm caught up here. Thanks for being here. This was fun. Again, tomorrow, it's going to be maybe less fun, more somber. We're going to look at the legacy of Jimmy Carter. I think I'm going to go live my usual time that I go in Monday mornings, 9 a.m. Central. So we'll see you then. Take care.